Welcome to the podcast for emerging and blue-collar leaders. This is The Growth Project. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to The Growth Project. Great to be back here with you. I know it's been a few weeks, and I've been really busy. I'm sure everyone else has as well. I've been traveling all around the place, doing lots of different interesting things. It's really awesome to be talking to you again. Hope you've all been well. I've actually received a few messages. I think I received an email and a couple through LinkedIn recently from a couple of people who have listened to previous episodes and have actually shared brief stories of some successes they've had implementing some of the little tips and tricks we've been sharing on the show here. So really love hearing about that. Don't hold back. Send them all through to me. I want to hear more and more of those. Really exciting stuff. I've also got a couple of episodes planned with some people who have some topics they'd like to talk about. So they're coming up soon in the next, next few episodes. And again, reach out to me if you're interested in coming on and having a chat about any of these themes. I'm really open to exploring all sorts of things with anyone who has something to share. So today, though, I'm wanting to put a spotlight on stress because any leader will know that stress is a factor. When we start leading teams and leading people and taking on more responsibility in the workplace, that does have an impact on our stress levels. Naturally, it's to be expected, right? So we're gonna talk a little bit about some of the things I've been learning about stress recently and some of the resources I've come across. There's one in particular that I'm going to share with you, which I think is a brilliant resource to tap into. So as leaders, though, if we don't have an awareness of the effects that stress can have on our performance and our cognition, then we might be at a disadvantage. So the thing that I've learnt as well is that some of the tools you can put in place, they're really not very complicated things to do and to put in place. So these are things you're going to be able to implement immediately to help you manage your stress levels. And as I said, though, it's really important that we recognize the importance of being able to implement tools and recognize when they need to be implemented. And I'm a big advocate too for really being able to preempt stressful periods in my work life, looking ahead and being able to anticipate when I might need to be on top of my stress management game. So we'll talk about that a little bit as well. But we all know that the modern workplace is changing rapidly. It's a very different landscape now as it was even a year or two ago, or especially 3 to 4 years ago. And as we're adapting to these, I guess, the demands of the modern workplace, we really have the potential for a perfect storm of stress. So as leaders, as stress levels rise, you might find yourself grappling with a range of challenges that impede your ability to lead effectively, and stress certainly is one of those big factors. So these challenges, though, they do manifest in various ways, like decreased decision-making ability, reduced productivity and performance, impaired communication with other people, and that will have an impact on the morale of your team, and an increase of errors and all of those sorts of things that just tend to cause more stressors. So when we're talking about stress, we're going to be talking about stressors, which is the things that can cause you stress, and then stress is the effect that it's having on you. So I mentioned decision-making ability. So we know that high levels of stress can impair cognition, and this can make it difficult for you to think clearly and make sound decisions. And this is a big part of your job as a leader. We need we can't have our hands tied behind our back here. So I mentioned productivity. It can cause burnout and exhaustion. It's really difficult to come back from burnout. I know for myself that if I've achieved states of, or not achieved, it's not something I'm aiming for. I have hit burnout in the past, and I find that for me, it can really take anything from 2 to 4 weeks to fully bounce back from. And that's a big problem for me if that happens. So that's why I've put a lot of focus recently on, when I say recently, in the last year and a half to 2 years, on being able to anticipate stressful periods and do some work to better prepare myself for them. I know that I'm not communicating effectively if I'm not managing my stress levels. So this can sometimes lead to misunderstandings, miscommunications, or even in some cases, conflict. The team morale that I mentioned earlier, don't underestimate the impact of that either. So I have been very vocal in this podcast about the fact that teams and people who you're leading tend to absorb the behaviors of those around them and then the environment that they're in. So we can see a decrease in motivation and engagement when we're not managing our stress, and that is rubbing off on our teams, or our teams are observing that and noticing that. We're also, I mentioned the risk of making errors, and this again comes back to cognition and the effect that it has on the brain's ability to process information effectively in the way that we normally would. So overall, what I'm saying is that stress does have a significant impact on your ability to effectively lead your teams and achieve whatever goals that you're setting out to achieve. So this is why it's so important to recognize the signs of stress, or to be able to preempt the stress and take steps to manage it effectively. So I mentioned earlier that there's a resource that I wanted to share with you, and that resource is a podcast that I was actually put onto called the Huberman Lab. And so the Huberman Lab podcast is a brilliant resource, and shout out to my good friend Adam for putting me onto that. Appreciate that, because it's such a brilliant resource. So everyone should listen to this podcast and subscribe to it. So Andrew Huberman is a professor in the Department of Neurobiology and Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the Stanford University School of Medicine. And he has launched a podcast. It's been going for a couple of years now. And his goal is just to share all of his knowledge with the general public for free. And how brilliant is that? We have access to that resource. And there are 2 episodes in particular pointing to stress management that he has published in the last couple of years. And I've actually posted those, or put the links into the show notes for you. And I really highly recommend that you listen to them, because he's got a fantastic way of describing all of these, what I would consider to be quite complicated concepts and subject matter. I'm not a neuroscientist and I'm not a scientist, so that has a potential for a lot of things to go over my head, but he has an excellent way of describing things to make sense to the layperson. So, and he really goes into detail about the physiological reasons as to why certain things happen, and the effects that some of these tools have on the body that then affect the mind. So I really encourage you to listen to this, because I'm only just not even barely scratching the surface on these concepts that I've learnt by listening to him. So, but what I do want to do though is share with you some of the really interesting facts that I've learnt and picked up from listening to this show and those 2 particular episodes. And the first one was that, and I guess when I listened to it and heard it, it did make sense. And I think I did have an awareness of this subconsciously, perhaps. But the first interesting thing I found was that there is a spectrum of stress, and that stress can actually be a really positive thing for us. So we know, though, that where we have a lack of stress or a deficiency of stress, this is what we'd call boredom. Yeah. So this is where we don't have an optimal level of stress. So this can be adverse for us as well. This can be a problem. Likewise, chronic stress to a stress overload can lead to structural, what he says is structural and functional changes in the brain, particularly in the regions responsible for decision making and emotional regulation, and of which we've spoken about a lot in this podcast, and the importance of being able to do those things effectively and manage our emotions. The fact that this is affecting that is something to be alert to. Not to mention also that chronic stress can trigger other physical conditions and problems as well. But what we're wanting to find is an optimal level of stress, and this is what he calls as being stimulated. Okay, so again, stress doesn't just mean that we're overwhelmed. So we do want this optimal level of stimulation, optimal level of stress. So this can help drive our performance and drive motivation and positive behaviors. So the other thing that I learned too was that stress management plans, they are not a one size fits all. They do need to be personalized. And what I also learned, which was interesting, is that what some people find really effective as a stress mitigation tool can actually be the opposite for other people. So it can be the opposite. It can be a stressor for other people. So he really promotes the fact that don't listen when people say that this is a, going and climbing a mountain or going and playing golf or whatever it might be is the best way to deal with your stress. The answer is that for those kinds of activities, they're not going to work for everybody, right? It'll work for some, but it won't work for others. So the other really fascinating thing is that, and this is something that I think has probably been my biggest flaw in managing my stress levels in the last couple of years, is that I've tended to try and push through my stressful week with the view that I'll do something that's going to relieve my stress on the weekend. I'll go and play some golf, or I'll go and do something with the kids. I'll have something planned to do, and that's going to alleviate my stress and balance things out again. And what I've learned is that that is actually not how it works. I'm still likely to get some benefit from doing those things, but what I've learned is that if you don't deal with your stress as it arises, and because you think about it, sometimes you might be at work, you can't just leave work and go and play golf or go to the beach or whatever it is that you like to do. You can't just always do that. So we tend to park stress management to the side until it's a convenient time for us to do it. But by doing that, we're risking having an accumulation of stress and building up towards this chronic stress that lingers in our system and causes adverse effects on us and our bodies and our minds. So we need to have then, because I can't just leave the workplace to go and play golf, for example, I need to have other tools as well that I can draw from. And I need tools that I can spend a longer amount of time on. I do want to use golf as a tool, but I also need tools that I'm going to be able to implement in a meeting or on a phone call or in a conversation. I need to be able to have tools that I can implement instantly to be able to manage what I'm dealing with. Again, listen to the podcast episodes that I've linked into the notes, because what he's done is he's actually provided some fantastic tools and techniques to try that are actually science-backed. These aren't just ideas. These are proven tools that you could benefit from considering and trying out, okay? So in terms of myself and how I manage my stress, I'm still evolving and I'm still developing my stress management plan, and it's evolving over time. But I'm getting to a point where I do have a good range of tools that allows me to deal with things as they come up more than I was before. Yeah. So I mentioned earlier burnout. When I don't manage my stress effectively, I am going to achieve a state of burnout because parking my stress management relief to the weekend was just not enough. So the first thing I wouldn't say the first thing actually, the latest thing I've been implementing is breathing exercises. And again, I picked this particular one up from the Huberman Lab podcast, and there's an episode in the notes called Master Stress. And this gives a great description of some really good breathing exercises and tips, including a description of what this does physically to your body and what effect it has in that managing of the stress. He says that it's very difficult to control the mind with the mind, especially when your stress levels are high. So he gives some really terrific tools to use that you can implement pretty much anywhere. So breathing exercises for me are an important tool because if I'm in a stressful situation while I'm at work, this is something I can implement anywhere, anytime during a conversation or a meeting or anything like that, right? So that's a great tool I can implement on the fly really quickly. But like I said before, I do like to go and play golf. I like to swing a golf club around it, and I might not be able to play a round of golf, and sometimes the weather's not conducive to that. So, going to these indoor golf places as well. It's also a good social outlet sometimes to go and do that with somebody else. But also I find that there's something a little meditative about playing golf that I myself enjoy. And golf's probably a really fantastic example of a stress relief tool that is great for some people, but not for others, because I've played golf with some people and it is clearly not a stress relief for these people. So again, an example of what's great for some people isn't always great for others. So, but the issue with the golf for me though is that it does take more time. It does require more time, and I don't always have that available to me. So I can't always use it as often as I'd like, but it is there for me to use as a tool if I need to. The other thing for me is that this podcast, the Growth Project podcast, is a growth project for myself. So it is a development tool that I'm doing for myself. There isn't another intent behind this other than just sharing information for people that I've learnt, but it's also a bit of a stress management tool for me and a development tool for me. So what I'm finding is that when I prepare for an episode, I do a lot of writing. I make a lot of notes and bullet points and things like that, and I might do some research, and I find that to be quite relaxing. And I find that what happens is it gets ideas and thoughts that are rattling around in my mind. It gets them out onto paper, so to speak, and I find that quite relaxing. I know it might sound strange to some, but I really do. I find it quite therapeutic because it's interesting. The topics are interesting for me, and there's no pressure involved. There's no outcome. I'm not competing with anything. I'm not trying to get an outcome of any kind. I'm just doing it because I'm just trying to get these ideas out of my head. There's no pressure attached to it. So it's just me being curious and exploring what's in my mind. So often I'll find that just by getting these ideas out of my head and onto paper, it dulls some of that noise in my mind enough to come back to a baseline of, I guess, regulation and mood. So the other thing that I'll do too, though, sometimes is if I'm hitting a block with that and I'm trying to write something and I'm struggling to articulate my thoughts or get things out of my mind, I'll call someone. I've got a few people that I'll just call and bounce ideas off, or if I've got concerns about something, or I've just come out of a conversation that stressed me out or whatever it might be, I've got people who I would call and just say, hey, let me just explain something to you. This is where my mind's at. Can you tell me, give me your perspective? Sometimes I'll find that they'll say, okay, look, I can see your concerns there, or I can see you've got an issue there, but yeah, and I think your approach could work. I think that, or it could be the opposite. It could be that I think you've just about lost your mind. You've gone way off on a tangent here, and those people will know who they are. So they'll say, Jace, you're overthinking this. I think you should just let this sit. It's going to be fine. And often that is the case. So other perspectives and just talking to other people about what's in your mind is a good tool as well. So I also find now another tool for me is that I'm trying to get into the regular habit of ending my workday with some form of physical movement. I find that if I've had a stressful, hard day, and when I go home after a long day, if I've done some physical movement, I feel very different walking into the home than I do if I just come straight from work back into the home environment. That can be pretty jarring, and I'm quite sure that everybody listening to this can relate to that. I find that having something in between to break that up makes a very big difference, right? So that's worth considering as well. I know that for me, a sleep routine is really important. I do go through periods where I can fall into the trap of scrolling on the phone for too long, and then all of a sudden it's really late in the night or early in the morning, and I'm setting myself up for a really short sleep, and that's not ideal. So I'm trying to become much more disciplined at limiting my device use 30 minutes before sleep time, before I want to be asleep. And I'll be expanding that up to an hour once I start really following that routine really closely. And I'd say it's working really well, actually. So, and we all know that the scrolling on the phone is no good for sleep patterns. The other thing about devices and phones is that I really recommend this. It's really easy these days to set a do not disturb environment for yourself on a scheduled basis. So every single workday, I've got 30 minutes at the same time every single day where all of my devices go into do not disturb mode, all of them, right? So, and you can set it so that you've allowed certain people to get through still in the case of an emergency, and you can put some flexibilities in there as well. But I find it very calming knowing that when I see that alert that my devices have gone into do not disturb mode, I've got 30 minutes where my phone isn't going to ring. I'm not going to be hit up with anything, any curveballs just for that short amount of time. And I can focus. I can either go and take a break, or I can focus on something that needs undivided attention at that time. So the do not disturb function on your phone, I know if you use Apple products, I use Apple products. So I'm not sure about how this works for other devices, but for me, if I set do not disturb on one of my devices, it changes it for all of them. So my laptop, if I'm using an iPad or a phone, it puts them all into that mode. And it's just nice to have 30 minutes where I'm kind of left alone, and I can choose to do that with that time, whatever it is I want. So look, I think I've just reeled off about 6 or 7 tools that I use, and that's not all of them, but that's just a good cross-section of some of the things that I do. And I'd be really interested to hear the thoughts of others on what you do. So please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm genuinely interested, and let's share this information around. I think it's important, because I think there are too many of us who are just trying to battle through our work week or month or whatever it is, or our days. Start putting together a customized, personalized stress management plan for yourself, right? So I've spoken about those things that I can do in response to stress. So I will just quickly mention too that you do need to be able to forecast your stress levels as well. And for me, I do a lot of travel for my day job, a lot of travel. Okay. So interstate travel is a very common thing for me. And it's not uncommon at times for me to be spending 80% of my life away from home, which not only causes stress for me, but for my family as well. Right. So, but for me, I know that if I'm looking ahead and I'm seeing a lot of travel in a short amount of time, I know that I've got to have all those tools ready to go. I need to try and be consciously aware of when those things are coming up in the moment, because sometimes when you're caught up in the daily activity, it can get pushed to the back of your mind. But again, in the interest of preempting, I know that I'm going to need to do things like stick to a strict sleeping routine leading up to that period of time. I need to utilize my tools like my to-do lists to start building a list of things that need to get done, so that because I do have some disposable time while I am traveling. I find that, between the hours of say 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. Is good for me to do a little bit of catch up or do some tasks for people that they're waiting on something from me. So I take magnesium supplement as well, which I find helps with, it does help with stress levels. It can just take that physical edge off that you can sometimes feel, that little uneasy feeling. Again, I'm not in the game of giving any medical advice. That's what I've learnt works for me. But so for me, magnesium helps with anxiety. It helps with stress. It helps with sleep as well. And the Huberman Lab podcast talks about some supplements that can be really beneficial for managing stress as well. So I find that works for me. But of course, you need to consult with your relevant healthcare professionals to find what works for you. And I also know that I need to open up channels of communication with people. I know that if I'm traveling a lot, it can feel very lonely at times. So making contact with people, a couple of phone call check-ins during the week, setting a regular schedule of I'm going to FaceTime my kids and my wife to have a chat each day. I need that. I find that really helps me. So again, it's about preempting that and making a bit of a schedule for myself that, okay, each day I need to do this at this time, this at that time, this at that time. I'll also try and get walks in. Again, it's that in the moment stuff as well. But I'm getting myself into the mindset of my routine before I need to start my routine for that period of time. So to wrap this up, really interested to hear what your thoughts are. Please get in touch. Let me know if you've got other suggestions and ideas, because I am interested in trying other things as well. Other than that, though, that's all I wanted to share with you today. Thank you so much for tuning in again. Really appreciate the fact that you've come back to keep listening. Really would be fantastic if you think you could perhaps leave a review or even a 5-star rating would be really helpful, so I can keep spreading this message to more people. Thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope you have a fantastic weekend, and I will speak to you next time.